On this video, I'm going to cover some of the content in chapter 7, which is on survey research. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview and sort of an emphasis of the most important parts. So this chapter covers the purpose of surveys, the advantages and disadvantages of surveys, the different types of surveys, and different types of analyses you can do with the data that you collect from a survey. Sometimes surveys are also called questionnaires, and so sometimes you'll see that terminology used in things that you read. We're not going to go heavy into data analysis because we'll cover that extensively next semester, but it's something that you can think about as you should be thinking about as you would design a survey instrument. So surveys can be used together, lots of different types of information. There's lots of different ways that you can disseminate a survey. The most common would be online. And so that's the most common way that you see them done, but sometimes they're done in person via the phone or by mail. You can, sampling, you can be very specific in the people that you are asking to take your survey. You may be less specific if you want sort of a broad group of people or, to generalize to a larger populations. You can do a randomized sample when you have a survey design. So maybe let's say I want to survey Ohio dental hygienists, and I can randomly select, a portion of the hygienists in the state of Ohio. You could do a stratified sample. It can be sort of a well-defined sample or a less well-defined sample, or just a convenience sample. So convenience of, let's say I'm surveying college students, and so I'm going to use the college students that are on the campus that I'm at, and that would be a convenience sample. Some of the challenges related to survey research would be that all the data that you're collecting really is self-reported. So you're relying that someone is reporting the correct information. And sometimes they may or may not want to disclose, or they may report the way that they think you want them to report the data. You rely again on your participants in the survey to interpret what you're asking. Sometimes it's hard to extrapolate the results to a population, so to generalize to a larger population with survey research. There were people who don't respond to your survey. And so the non-respondents, you don't get their information. And so we don't know what they think about a particular thing, or how they, how they manage particular things in their office maybe. And so we don't have, those non-respondents are sort of important part of that. And we don't have their, their information. And then respondent bias, basically any biases that the respondent has. They may interpret sort of your question in one way or in another way. They may think you want them to answer in a certain way, and so that's the way they answer. So here's a nice table from the text. General advantages generally are relatively low cost. You have a lot of flexibility in your sample size. You can gather information on lots of different things. You can do it in a variety of different ways, and you can learn a lot and make a big impact with survey research. Some of the disadvantages we sort of talked about before. Respondent self-report. There's no way to ensure, that they're responding correctly. They may interpret things differently. There may be a bias. Can we generalize to even those who didn't respond in there? And then sometimes the way the item may be worded or interpreted, there could be a bias that way. And some of these disadvantages you can control by your design of your methods, and also the design of your instrument. So like we talked about before, the most common way we disseminate surveys would be online. We do have, if you are looking to do a survey, we do have, the university has a subscription to Qualtrics. And so you as a student would have access to that and could create a survey and disseminate it through that, through the university subscription. So planning is really important in survey research. You really need to know, what are the objectives of the study? What am I trying to, find out and answer? One of the things you'll see reported in survey research is a response rate. And so, You want to try to get the most people to respond. And so some of the guidelines that the text offers is you need some type of introductory statement. The instrument, the actual survey has to be really well designed and it has to be easy to use. They should be able to complete the survey in a short period of time. So many of you maybe have clicked on a link to a survey that you were filling out and it just became really long. And so maybe you stopped filling it out. You can include either an inducement or some type of gift for completing the survey. And some, follow-up requests may spur some response. So following up, if you send it out to your random sample once, you maybe want to follow up a week later to those who maybe haven't responded. Some suggestions that the text has for email surveys. Start with your questions that are most important. So the questions that you really want to get answers to, and then maybe some of the other like demographic questions could go at the end. You make it as appealing as possible. So, make sure it's readable, limit the length, make sure you send reminders, and, identifying that you're answering this confidentially, and so that your individual responses won't be tied to you as a specific individual. So in your introduction to the survey, it needs to be well worded, whether or not it's paper or internet, or the phone. You need to be informative and explain to the participant what your study is about. It should be concise. It shouldn't be too long. It should be easy to understand. The level of language that you use and wording and grammar should be appropriate for your population, and making sure that you're proofreading and editing your survey. The other thing to think about with your survey is in the introduction is you also want to make sure that the survey works properly, particularly if you are disseminating this online, is that you want to ask someone to take the survey to ensure that it's working the way it should. Follow-up is essential with surveys, so it'll help increase your response rates. I know a lot of studies that we have done that involve surveys, we get a good response the first time we send it out, the next day or two, we have a high number of responses, and then it kind of trickles down. And then maybe a week or two later, we send another reminder and the responses go up again. And so following up is an important part. You need to keep it, private and confidential, just like any other study, and be able to ensure the confidentiality of your participants. Some surveys would need an identification code or some way to code it to a particular person. Other surveys don't need that. And so you sort of have to think about what your population is and what your question is. As I said before, so web-based surveys, online surveys are what you see today. You can send it out to a large sample size. You can collect a large amount of data. That data is nicely put into a report for you. You can download that data for analysis pretty easily. Sometimes web-based surveys are tough because maybe getting someone the link is difficult, or getting them to finish it. Sometimes people misinterpret the items, and your target population has to have online access, and you have to be able to find them that way. So here are just some of the aspects of web-based surveys. Generally, this is the common way. I want you to look here at response rate. So this is a question that I get from students frequently when they use sort of a survey-based design, is they say, oh, I only have 25% response rate. And so knowing that the literature really supports that a response rate greater than 30% is fairly rare. So something in the 20s is pretty strong. And so knowing that you think only 30% of your population responded in web-based surveys, that's actually fairly good. So just keep that in mind. Phone surveys are a little less common, but depending on who your population is, that might be a better way to collect some of your data, and some maybe personal interviews where you actually sit down one-on-one with someone and ask them questions. So the next part of this is the survey item. So your actual survey instrument is really important, and you need to make sure that you are asking questions that will help answer your research questions. So thinking about all the data, does this help me, all the questions you ask, does it help me answer my research question hypothesis or null hypothesis? And so you really only need to ask questions that relate to that. So let's say that, you know, we were collecting data and we weren't really concerned about the relationship of gender to any of these items. We may not need to ask a question about gender unless we really wanted to look at, is there a difference in gender, or is that, you know, something we want to analyze? But if not, maybe you don't need to ask that question. So you really only want to ask the questions that you need in order to answer your research questions, and not ask additional questions. So we talked a little bit about this null hypothesis and a hypothesis, so and a research question. So here's just some examples of those, and that helps guide what your survey would look like. The other thing to think about with a survey instrument is you may want to use a survey instrument that already exists. And so if other people have asked similar questions, you may want to use a survey instrument that already exists, so you're not creating one from scratch. You can also modify an existing instrument, maybe to meet your population. So maybe you found a survey that was done with nurses about work-life balance, and you wanted to do the same thing in dental hygienists. And so maybe you get permission to use that survey, but you just change, you know, the nursing specific things to dental hygiene specific things. You may collect data, demographic data about your population, and so that tells you a little bit about who answered your survey. Some of these things might be age, gender, occupation, education, and should really only be information that you intend to use. Make sure to be specific with demographic data. Make sure if you're using a range. So if let's say your age 20 to 25, and then the next range should be 26 to something else. It shouldn't be 25, because if I was a 25-year-old, it might be difficult for me to, you know, determine which one do I put myself in. So no overlapping ranges. You know, you don't have to ask for the same data in more than one statement or question. Have it be to the point, and only stuff that's relevant to the study is things that you need to ask as far as demographic information. You really want to ensure that you have a reliable and valid instrument, and that's why sometimes using an already existing instrument is better than creating your own. You know, ensuring the reliability and validity of a survey instrument is quite a process. And so you could do some content validity and some reliability on some pilot studies, but generally using an instrument that already exists with some of this data would be more helpful. Survey items should be short, clear, exact, answerable, and they need to be related to the research questions. So sometimes as you're looking to create your surveys, you maybe want to write down every question that you can think of. And then you want to think about, you know, categorizing them and then deciding, does this question really answer my research questions? And if it doesn't, then you would eliminate it. Different questions on surveys can have different sort of formatting. And so a structured format allows you to control the responses. So I'm going to only give you 5 choices, and you're going to choose one of those 5. If it's open-ended or unstructured, you would have them write in. And so sometimes you have to, you know, read into those, and sometimes they're difficult to interpret. These are from your text, some different types of ways, different types of questions you could ask in your survey. So some of them, you know, comparison, you could use a visual analog scale for depending on what type of information you're gathering. Ask them to rank things. And so there's lots of different types of formats that questions can answer. If you're using any ranking, you know, be sure that the ranking numbers are defined. Specify whether they should rank everything or just like a top 3. Instructions should be clear, and the item format should be consistent. A common question type on a survey would be a Likert scale. And so a lot of these are strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And so this is a common Likert scale that you've probably seen on some, surveys that you have taken before. Sometimes we decide to take out the neutral, so someone would have to lean towards agree or disagree, but sometimes neutral is included, and it can be done either way. Verbal frequency scales are probably something you've also seen, and ask them to give sort of a level of agreement with an item. So this example is, how often are ACE inhibitors given as the first drug in hypertension therapy? So if you're a provider who, prescribed ACE inhibitors, I would, choose, okay, occasionally or often or always, in deciding this. So those are verbal frequency scales. Again, being concise, making sure it's clearly understood, is an important part of that. Each item also should have an equal number of positive and negative responses. With a neutral response, if possible. Sometimes we decide to leave a neutral response out, but you shouldn't have 3 positive choices and 1 negative choice. If you were offering 4 choices, it really should be 2 positive and 2 negative. So that's an important part of structuring your questions. Here's just some, tips on using these types of different scales and these types of questions. These are good, good things to remember as you are creating a survey. So kind of finally putting it all together, there needs to be some introduction. It should be easy to read, make sure the visual quality is good. So particularly many people take these on mobile devices. And so you want to make sure that your survey is mobile friendly. And then proofread and have someone else proofread things. You don't want to have any proofreading errors. You may need to do some pilot testing, especially if it's an instrument that you have created. And a pilot test can be a small group of people who can give you feedback on the initial instrument. There can, you would ask things like, are there too many questions? How much time is needed? Are each item clear and concise? Is there something that we would need to clarify? And then are the responses appropriate? So am I asking the right, giving the right options for that type of question? Here's some other questions you may want to ask if you are pilot testing a survey. So one thing to remember is you can't survey participants until your IRB approval is granted. And so you can't just start surveying people. You have to make sure that you have IRB approval. You will have a period where the results start to accumulate, and you want to make sure you keep good records and protect confidentiality. When you think about how many people you need in your survey research, it really just depends. It depends on what we're studying and what we're doing, and we'll learn a little bit more about that in our stats course. We'll learn a little bit more about this, but generally you would set it at a 95 or 99% confidence interval, depending on the subject matter. And we just, basically how confident are we that, we're only going to take a chance of a 5% error or a 1% error in our data. But we'll learn a little bit more about this in the stats course. Again, stats to use is really about, we'll learn the specifics because it depends on what types of questions you ask. If you ask a Likert style questions, that may warrant one analysis. If you ask yes and no questions, that might be another type of analysis. And then if you ask open-ended questions, that's a whole nother analysis altogether. So those are just some of the highlights from survey research. Your article this week is also a survey, so you can see how some of those things are implemented within an actual study.